The huge technological achievements of the ancient Egyptians have fascinated people from all around the world for more than 2,000 years. The Egyptians held a unique view of death and the afterlife, with the possibility of resurrection. Death is a door through which we all must pass, and every civilization and society has tackled this issue. We have defined these cultures by their attitudes to death and how they handle the concept of what happens after. A lot of what we know about the ancient Egyptian culture and their belief in the afterlife are from funerary contexts. Those tombs that have been excavated and investigated, some of which have been robbed in antiquity, which provided limited but still important information nonetheless. The afterlife was very important. How they lived on in the physical plane was reflected in their tombs, along with all of their achievements in life, painted on the walls. So they made a copy of their life to take with them. This included food, animals, furnishings, and people. Worcester Museum looks after a collection of Egyptian artefacts. These primarily came from Haraj, the Corbett collection, and then supplemented by other donors through the years. The collection used to be bigger than this, but at some point some of these objects left us. This is ongoing work to establish what we have left and to marry those objects up against our registers. The main body of the excavations were undertaken at Haraj, a vast cemetery site under the direction of Flinders Petrie, who worked on sites under the British School of Archaeology in Egypt. Petrie was also looking into the pyramid at Lahun, so he stayed there while the rest of the excavation team stayed in cabins that they built in Haraj. Reginald Engelbach was conducting operations supported by Petrie on site, and he was there in October 1914. Engelbach produced a detailed report of what was found, and in it he is very apologetic that the report was finished in 1923, the obvious delay being World War I. Not all the original team survived until 1923, but not being killed in action as you would think. In a dramatic turn of events, Mr. Wiley, who was working at Haraj with Engelbach, was treacherously murdered by the Kurdish guides in Mesopotamia shortly after the armistice. This is a picture of Mr. Frost, who was primarily there to pack the objects as they came out of the excavations. These objects were to be sent to the British Museum in their cemetery groups, and after were rearranged to go to other institutions around the country. These other institutions funded the fieldwork in Egypt and were given objects to the amount proportionate to what they donated for the research. Mr. Frost donated his collection to Worcester Girls' Grammar School, and eventually it was donated by Miss D. Frost to Worcester Museum. Miss Frost, we suspect, was a relation. Haraj was a multi-period cemetery site which had been looted over the course of the centuries. However, there was still information and finds that were discovered. The finds date from pre-dynastic with the discovery of flint tools to the Coptic era, which is after the third intermediate period. Before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, many of the rediscovered burials made by archaeologists had been looted, either in antiquity or later, so knowledge of attitudes to death, how they perceived the afterlife, and what they included in their tombs was limited. Not much of the domestic material had survived the looters, so the discovery of this particular tomb was a groundbreaking moment. It demonstrated the role of the tomb as a house of eternity, which would keep the body of the tomb owner for all of their eternal life. In order to live that eternal life, the person must be sustained, as in physical life. Food and drink, furniture, vessels, clothes, linens, all of the objects that were used in life were interred with the body, also including objects imbibed with magical properties, thought to protect the owner during their eternal life. The important part of the rituals surrounding the deceased were all about achieving a higher plane of existence. Not every body made it to the afterlife. The survival of the deceased depended on a number of procedures. Attaining the afterlife meant that certain physical and non-physical aspects of self had to be looked after. The body had to be mummified with various organs removed and preserved. A representation of the deceased called the ka had to be made. This complex figure, whose concept changed over time, was supposed to be a direct copy of the tomb owner. During life, the deceased could feed themselves. After death, this was not possible, so by feeding the ka, this was the principal way in which the deceased would receive nourishment in the afterlife. Funeral offerings of food were often left for the ka. Another complicated concept was the ba. This is sometimes translated as the personality of the deceased. The ba spirit is not a physical being, but is capable of free and unrestricted movement, often depicted as a bird with a human head on tomb walls. The ba was the spirit that separated from the body at death and could fly to visit the world of the living and travel with the sun god in his celestial boat. Each night the ba had to come back to the corpse in order to be reunited. If it didn't, the deceased would perish in the afterlife. The preservation of the name of the deceased was also important. Most ancient Egyptian names personified a meaning and was directly related to their well-being. Many names imbibed the protection of a particular god or goddess. In order to survive the afterlife, remembering the name was essential. They inscribed the name on the doorways, coffins, steles, the facade of the tomb, and many other places. To remove it was a sacrilege and killed the deceased in the afterlife. Essential knowledge was also needed in order to get through the many trials of getting to the afterlife. These texts, for instance, the Book of the Dead, was painted all over the tomb walls and ceilings. Once all of these procedures and trials had been completed, you were considered worthy of the gods and goddesses. You achieved this higher plane of existence. You had become Ark. I shall now go through some of the objects that we take care of in the Egyptian collection that explains this a little bit more. For kings, queens, and high-status individuals, being able to live in the afterlife with their servants was important. During the first dynasty, the king was attended by them. Their graves were often discovered around the king's tomb. It is possible that they were put to death at the time of the king's interment. They were there to provide their services in the afterlife. After the first dynasty and into the fourth and fifth, servant figures were made from materials in order to accompany the king. Servant figures were generally depicted in an activity like making bread or beer or doing other occupations. These types of figures that you see here on the slide were the Shapti, Ushapti and Shawaptis. Many of these have been found in funerary contexts. Shaptis were found in the graves of the Middle and New Kingdom, Shawaptis in the 17th dynasty, and the term Ushapti was used from the 21st dynasty until the Ptolemaic period. First found in tombs from around 2100 BC, by 1000 BC they were being mass-produced. The nature of the figures were a bit interchangeable. The Shaptis were a type of servant figure, who could also epitomise the owner of the grave, as well as possessing the ka of the deceased. A replica body discussed in the last slide. Shaptis contained the name of the individual represented, preceded by the offering formula, and some contained magical spells, all carved onto the figure. Worcester Museum looks after several examples of these and are made of several different materials. The ones made from ceramic are generally quite poor. However, the collection also contains a wooden one with traces of paint still attached, and several glazed faience. More work needs to be done to try and trace where the faience ones came from, but we do know that those made from clay were from the Engelbach Petrie excavations at Haraj. Amulets were often placed within the wrappings of the mummy before being laid inside the tomb for burial, as either protective symbols or to assist the bearer through the complexities of the afterlife. As one of the most common symbols associated with ancient Egypt, the Wadjet eye fulfilled many functions in Egyptian mythology. This is the amulet on the right. Depending on which way the eye is represented, either left or right, it would give the eye different functions. The left eye represented the powerful falcon-headed god Horus, and is associated with the moon. Lunar Horus embodied healing and regeneration, thought to bring safety to the wearer and let the dead pass into the afterlife without danger. The eye looking right symbolises the sun god Ra. Very much like the eye of Horus, the eye of Ra has a protective element by warding off evil and for protecting those who bear the image. The amulet to the left is a depiction of Shu. He was the powerful god of air, who was created by the great god Atum. Atum was also known by another name, Ra, who was the first god, creator himself. Shu is one of the oldest gods in the pantheon, who had a sister, Tefnut. Shu's symbol is the ostrich feather, which represented air. His main function was to support the heavens by kneeling on the earth with his arms raised above his head, holding up the sky goddess Nut. Shu was the sun's protector, as well as helping to determine the fate of souls after death, and was often worshipped in the form of a lion, and his twin sister Tefnut, a lioness. This amulet is only a few centimetres in length. Many amulets, if they were not worn, would have been included in the linen wrappings of the mummy. The pot at the top of this slide is only 2.5 centimetres tall and came from Cemetery A, which comprised of 103 graves and lay on a slight ridge about a mile south of the village of Haraj. The dates of the cemetery comprised of mainly 12th dynasty Middle Kingdom shaft tombs, which would have been around the era of the pharaohs Senusret II to Amenemhet III. The Middle Kingdom was generally considered to be Egypt's age of culture, producing great works of art and literature made only possible by the stability of the 11th dynasty. All graves from Cemetery A had been robbed in antiquity. Unfortunately, we are not sure which grave this would have come from. Little pots like these were found in many funerary contexts and have been interpreted as an offering cup. The beautiful glazed terracotta jar that you see here on the slide is 13.5 centimetres high. This also came from Haraja and is dated to the 18th dynasty. Tombs in general would have contained many objects that supported the deceased in his or her afterlife. Too many to go through for this talk, unfortunately, and Worcester Museum's collection, even though small, is no less interesting. Continuing work with the collection is ongoing and will focus on finding out more from the Corbett collection, where it came from and how it entered the museum. More research will also be undertaken, and we hope to forge links with museums that contain other collections excavated by Flinders Petrie. I really hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, and we all look forward to welcoming you to our museums in the future. Thank you for watching.